by Rabbi Yankel Rapp in memory of his father's yahrzeit, Rab Shmuel Rabbi Yankev HaKoyen. The yahrzeit was on the past Shabbos of Vav Mar Cheshvan. So he's dedicating, today's shir is dedicated to his memory. The Neshamas al Habman Aliyah, and he should be a Melitz Yesher, a good better for Yankel and his family, for Rabbi Yankel Rapp and his family. Yeah, B'Serch Klal Yisrael, L'chaim v'Levrach.
Amen. Chaim, Chaim, Shloach.
And being that the shir is dedicated to a Kohen and sponsored by a Kohen, we will discuss an inyan which is negayed to Kohanim. And that is as follows. The Rambam tells us and teaches us in Hilchas Melachim U'Melchamoisei and Perik Chi, the 9th Perik, Halacha Aleph. So there, if you have a Rambam, excuse me, before we go on, for all those, in order to preach, to share, to appreciate what's going to go on here, to please take out a Chumash Bereshis, and if possible, a Chumash Bamidbar, because we're going to be focusing on the Parshas in Parshas Lech Lecha, and in Parshas Toldos, and in Parshas Matos. So please be so kind and take out, have you an access to a Chumash, Chumash Torah. If you have a Rambam, as other Rabbi, take out your Rambam. And Hilchas Melachim says the Rambam, Perik Chi, in the 9th Perik, the Rambam enumerates the mitzvahs which were commanded and kept before Matan Torah. And he enumerates the 6 mitzvahs which Adam Rishon was commanded in, then a 7th mitzvah which Noach was commanded in. And the Rambam says, so was followed. Those are the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, and that's what was followed b'chol ha'olam till Avram. The Rambam goes on to say, Avram was nitztava yeser al elu b'mila. In addition to the 7 mitzvahs, Avram was nitztava, was commanded in Mila. V'hu hispalel shachris, and he daven shachris. The Yitzchak hifrish Maaser. Yitzchak added another mitzvah, and that is he was separated tithes. And he added another tefillah towards the evening, and that is the tefillas mincha. And he continues, Yaakov added another mitzvah, Gid Hanosha. We will be learning about it later on in the Parshas, and Vayishlach, and he davened Arvis. And he concludes, B'Mitzrayim nitztavo Amram b'mitzvahs Yiseris and Mitzrayim. Amram, Moshe's father, was commanded in additional mitzvahs. What mitzvahs did the Meforshim discuss? What mitzvahs? They go out of their way to find which mitzvahs Amram was commanded in. And he concludes, Acha b'Moshe Rabbeinu v'nishlam ha'Torah al yodo, until Moshe Rabbeinu came. The Torah was completed through Moshe Rabbeinu. And there's a separate discussion, which we're not going to discuss now. Why is it relevant for the Rambam to bring and enumerate all of this as an introduction to Moshe Rabbeinu, as if to say that, as if we know, the Rambam himself writes in the Sechta Chulin in Pirush HaMishnayos, the known Pirush HaMishnayos, referenced many times in the Rebbe's works in the Likutei Sichos. The Rambam says that we do Mekayim our mitzvahs only because Moshe HaKadosh Baruch Hu was a mitzvah Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai, and he mentions the Gid Hanosha there too. And he says also the same in mitzvahs Mila. Nevertheless, the Rambam enumerates the different mitzvahs because if you'll take a good look at the Pirush HaMishnayos, you'll see that Maaser is similar bonim. It's relevant to know that there was a mitzvah Mila by Avram and a mitzvah Gid Hanosha by Yaakov. Nevertheless, we do it because we were commanded from Moshe by Sinai. Okay, so this seems to be identified with what he says in Pirush HaMishnayos. But again, the focus is on the Hasogas HaRavid. The Ravid, when he sees that the Rambam highlights and says, the Yitzchak Hifrish Maaser, the Rambam is speaking and says, Avram was nitztava yeser aleilu b'mila, and Avram Avinu was commanded a mitzvah smila, like we learn at the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, in this week's parsha. V'hu hispalel shachris, and he davened shachris. Then he says, what did Yitzchak add? The Yitzchak hifrish Maaser, and he added another tefillah. So on this, the Ravid says, Omar Avram, the Ravid says, So would be fitting to state. The Rambam should have stated, V'hu hispalil shachris v'hifrish meiser. V'hu, meaning Avraham Avinu. Ad Avraham nitztava yeser aleilu b'mila. V'hu, and Avraham Avinu hispalil shachris v'hifrish meiser. Avraham daven shachris, and he separated tithes. The Yitzchak hoisiv tefillah acheres, and Yitzchak added another prayer. In other words, the Rambam makes it very clear that this additional mitzvah, this mitzvah of Afroshas Maaser, came about only in the time of Yitzchak. Yitzchak hifrish Maaser. Mashenk in the Ravid claims, no, Avram hifrish Maaser. V'hu hifrish Maaser. Avram was the one who was mafresh Maaser. Okay, so we're going to discuss this. That will be the focus of our discussion tonight. And there's a novel, Rogatchover. The Rogatchover reconciles and explains the Shittas Rambam, of course. And he dafka also protects the others who aren't dafka in the Shit of the Rambam. But before we go on, let me just bring to your attention that a fair amount of the information we will discuss tonight is presented in the works in the Likutei Sichos of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Chusay Yogan Aleinu, and I'll just reference them for you. That's in Likutei Sichos volume Hey, the 5th volume, in Parshas Lech Lecha, and then also in Likutei Sichos volume 13, Chelik Yud Gimel, in Parshas Matos, and also in Likutei Sichos volume 25, Chelik Chaf Hey, in Parshas Toldos. Okay, so we'll pluck out some information from there and some additional information as we go on. Now, immediately on the spot in the Forshei Rambam, already the Migdalois, the Farish on the Rambam, the Migdalois, it was a Talmud of the Rashba. Quite often we don't know what the Migdalois means to say, as the Amshel Shlomo already discusses the Mechaber of the Migdalois. He doesn't know, we speak very straightforward. It's hard to figure out what he's saying. Here it's very clear. He brings to our attention that there are Medroshes Chlukos. In other words, was it Avram who initiated Maaser, or was it Yitzchak who initiated Maaser? So true, it's very clear from the Rambam, number one, that they weren't commanded in Mitzvahs Maaser, as it's the Kesef Mishnah already brings to our attention, and also the Radvaz, that the Rambam says that it was in Mitzvahs Mila, he was nitztava b'Mitzvahs Mila, and he doesn't write the expression, the language of Sivuy in relation to Maaser. In other words, these are mitzvahs they did on their own accord, they weren't commanded in them. So they will all agree to that. That's not a problem. Another thing, the Lecha Mishnah, for instance, raises a point. The Gemara says in Masechta Yuma Daf Chav Ches, and the Mishnah Seif Masechta Kedushin, that Avraham Avinu was Mekayim Kol HaTorah Kul Nitne, was Mekayim all the Torah, even mitzvahs the Rabbanon. Nevertheless, the Rambam seems to mention only specific mitzvahs. So already the Aruch HaShulchan and many Meforshim explain and tell us that the Rambam wants to highlight. Of course, there's no question. It says in the Shas that Moshe Avraham Avinu was Mekayim Kol HaTorah Kul Nitna. The Rambam is dafke here out to enumerate and mention the mitzvahs which were kept before Matan Torah, which are mentioned in the Chumash, or at least explained in psukim according to the Chazal. In other words, we have psukim for them to convey that these mitzvahs were kept, especially if they're explicit in the Chumash. So therefore, there's this discussion and this argument between the Rambam and the Ravid. The Rambam holds it's the Yitzchak who initiated on his own accord the mitzvah of separating of Maaser, and the Ravid holds it's Avram Hifrish Maaser. So like I say, the Migdalois, interestingly, he says that Bechlal in general, there was Afroshas Maaser, right? All along, even before their times, Mimei Kedem, we find that Maaser was already separated and given, the tithes were given, the truma was given, all the different types of Maaser. You see, the Rambam doesn't say exactly what Maaser we're talking about. Stimas l'shoinoi, it says Yitzchak hifrish Maaser is stam. Val derech zeh the Ravid says Avram v'hu hifrish Maaser. What Maaser are we talking about? Now, interestingly, as we will go on, we will see. So let me continue with the Migdalois. The Migdalois says that it's medrash is chulukos, the different medrashim, and that is as follows. And so also the Kesef Mishnah and the Radvaz bring to our attention. If you'll take out a Chumash, please be so kind and take out your Chumash in Parshas Lech Lecha. In Chumash it says, Umalki Tzedek, that's Parsha Yudalet, Kapitel Yudalet, Posuk Yudches. It says after the war between the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and Avraham Avinu was Menatzeach, won the war, right? And he was successful in this, in beating the 4 kings, and he saves Sdoim, Amora, Lot, and all his belongings, etc. And after the war, it says in the Chumash, Malki Tzedek Melech Sholem, Hoitzi Lechem V'yoyin, V'hu Choyin La'el Elyoin. So it says, Bepashtus, meaning Malki Tzedek, Rashi says, and the Chazal say that's Shem, the son of Noach. So he is the Kohen. And he goes on, the Pasuk concludes, Vayiten loy Maaser Mekol. He gives him Maaser Mekol, meaning Avram Vayemar. This is all what Malki Tzedek says. Then it says, Vayiten loy Maaser Mekol. He gives him Maaser Mekol. Who is giving the Maaser Mekol? So Bepashtus, who are we talking about? We're talking about Avram. And Avram, who would we give Maaser to? We give Maaser or Truma to who? To the Kohen. Actually, the Panim Yafis already makes a point of it. That Maaser, the 10th tithes, the 10th we usually give to the Levi. The Truma we give to the Kohen. And if we're talking about a Kohen over here, so why do we say Vayiten loy Maaser Mekol? So the Panim Yafis, the Rebbe of the Chassam Sofer, tells us already that it follows with the opinion of the Shas that Maaser was also given to the Kohen. So B'meila, that's the way he reconciles it. I've noticed that others don't make an issue of it. And the Maaser is like a general term. It doesn't mean dafka a 10th. It means in general. In other words, he separates a section, a tribute, a section of his property, of what he owns, to what? To the Kohen. Okay. So here we see that Avram is mafresh Maaser. So therefore the Mefarshim say this is what the Ravid means. Vuhu hifresh Maaser. Avram is mafresh Maaser. The Rambam, when he says v'yitzchak hifresh Maaser, that follows with in Parshas, what we learn in Parshas Toldos. It says in Parshas Toldos, in Parshas Toldos we read, it says in the Pasuk in Kapitel Chavav, chapter 26, Pasuk, Kapitel Chavav, Pasuk Yud Beis, it says, Vayizra Yitzchak Ba'aretz Ahi, Vayimtza Bashon Ahi, Me'eh Sha'orim, Vayivarcheu Hashem. I'll translate it in English. Yitzchak sowed in that land, and in that year he reaped 100-fold. Thus had Hashem blessed him, and Rashi says, from the Chazal, and also the Ramban and other Rishonim record this medrash. This medrash, Rashi says, Rabbi Seinu Omru, I made Zel Maisrois. Rabbi Seinu, meaning the sages in the medrash, teach us that this assessment, when it says, Vayimtza Bashana Ahi Me'eh Sha'orim, there was an assessment made. So Rashi says, Me'eh Sha'orim, Sha'amdua, Kama Ru'uya Lasis, Va'osasa Alacha Sha'amdua Me'eh. Right, they assess the field to determine how much is it fit to produce, and it produced 100-fold. And that's what Rashi says, that what was this? This assessment was for L'maisrei Soya, was done for tithes. The Mele, when the Rambam says V'yitzchak hifresh Maaser, he's referring to what it says Vayizra Yitzchak Ba'aretz Ahi, Vayimtza Bashona Ahi Me'eh Sha'orim. The Chazal say that it was L'maisrei. That from there we know V'yitzchak hifresh Maaser. That's what the Rambam means. Interestingly, the Meshech Chochma, Rab Meir Simcha, in the Meshech Chochma, on the Pasuk Vayehi Loi Miknei Tzoin U Miknei Vokar Va'avuda Rabba, in sequence to that Pasuk where it tells us that Yitzchak hifresh Maaser, so he substantiates it with this message of the Pasuk. It says Vayehi Loi, he acquired Miknei Tzoin U Miknei Vokar. Miknei Tzoin would mean flocks of sheep and goats. U Miknei Vokar, herds of cattle, which are oxen. Okay, so the Meshech Chochma brings to our attention the Mishnah in the beginning of the 9th parak of Masechta Bechoros, And it's also, the Rambam also records and codifies it in Hilchos B'choros, Perek Zayin, Halacha Daled, the Mishnah and the Rambam Paskin. The halacha is that you can't bring, there's a din of Maaser. Generally, we know Maaser. We just learned the Maaser of Yitzchak Hifrish Maaser was referring to Maaser of Karka, of the crop, of the harvest, what grows from the ground. That is halachically the Maaser of the harvest of the crop. And that's what Yitzchak was mafresh, and that's what the Rambam means, Yitzchak Hifrish Maaser. But the Rambam doesn't detail what kind of Maaser. Says the Meshech Chochmah, it also incorporates Maaser Behema. And that's the reason why the Torah goes on to say, Vayehi lo miknei tzoin or miknei vokar. Why does it say miknei tzoin separately or miknei vokar separately? It could have written Vayehi lo miknei tzoin or vokar. Throughout the Chumash you find tzoin or vokar, and that is flocks and herds. A general, in other words, the sheep, flocks of sheep and herds of cattle are usually introduced as one unit, and here they're segregated. Miknei tzoin, which would be flocks of sheep and goats, and miknei vokar would be herds of cattle. Says he, because the Mishnah paskins that if you want to bring Maaser, you have to bring tithes from every 10 animals. And the din is that ein ma'ashrin min atzoin ala bokar, ve'ein ma'ashrin min abokar ala tzoin. You can't separate tithes. You have to give separate tithes from the tzoin, from the flocks of the sheep. You have to bring separate Maaser behemoth tithes from the behemoths, from the what? From the herd of the cattle. That's what the Torah highlights. And that's why Yitzchak, when he raised them, he had separate miknei tzoin and separate miknei vokar. Now within tzoin, we have, it means sheep and goats. The din is that sheep and goats, we can be Maaser one from another. That's the din. The din is that what? That kvosim misashrin ze im ze. That we can be Maaser from sheep and goats and sheep. So therefore, that's one category, miknei tzoin, which would mean sheep. That's the flocks of sheep and goats. Then, because the Isur, the Maaser Behemah, can be taken from that as one unit, but miknei vokar, which is the herds of cattle, which are oxen, they have to be separated separately. So you see the Meshech Chochmah Rameir Simcha, when the Rambam says the Yitzchak Hifrish Maaser, it's talking about Maaser min HaTorah. We're talking about Maaser Behemah because that's a din of the Torah. You have to give tithes from Behemah, just like you have to give tithes from Karka. But nevertheless, because the Rambam doesn't identify what kind of Maaser, so therefore the Yitzchak Hifrish Maaser is both based on the Meir Shorim, and it's reflected in the pasuk that he is also giving Maaser Behemah. We're moving on, and this is as follows. Nevertheless, so the Meforshim explain, like we mentioned, that the Shita of the Rambam and the Shita of the Rivit are already found in different Medrashim. Interestingly, what the Migdal Ois brings to our attention, he says that the reason why the Rambam says V'yitzchak Hifrish Maaser, and Avram wasn't the one who was Mafresh Maaser, even though we have an explicit pasuk in Parshas Lech Lecha, which we just read, and that is Vayiten Maaser Mekol. It says Mefurish, he gives a Maaser. So he comes up with this novel pshat when it says Vayiten Maaser Mekol. It's not Avram Avinu giving shame v'hu kohen to the kohen. It's fakert. It's shame ben Noach giving Maaser to who? To Avram Avinu. That's Vayiten Maaser Mekol. Who is giving Maaser? He's giving the Maaser. Shame is giving Maaser dafka to who? To Avram Avinu. And this pshat is dafka brought in the Chizkuni by the Rishonim and the Riva ala Torah, and also in the Torah Orach ala Torah, and the Torah Orach ala Torah brings it b'shem the father of the Radak. So the Rishonim already mentioned these two pirushim had a taich Vayiten Maaser Mekol. So therefore, says the Maaser, the Migdal Ois, it's not so posher to say that this pasuk is telling us that it's Avram Hifrish Maaser. Of course, the Rivit doesn't accept that, and that's why he says Avram Hifrish Maaser. The other Rishonim, the other Meforshim, like the Radvaz, for instance, the other Achronim, in other words, the Meforshi Rambam, the Radvaz, he claims that the reason why the Rambam dislikes, doesn't accept, and doesn't appreciate the pasuk that Yitzchak, that Avram Hifrish Maaser from an explicit pasuk Vayiten Maaser Mekol, is because the Maaser in the Torah is Maaser Karkois. You have to give tithes from what? From the Karkois, from the crop, from the harvest. And here it says Vayiten Maaser Mekol. It would seem is giving a Maaser from the Sholol, from the spoils, but it's lav dafka Maaser Karkois. So because it's not the Maaser which is recorded in the Torah, the Rambam wants to record such mitzvahs which were kept before Matan Torah by the Avos, which were eventually mitzvahs Minat Torah. Or, like the Kesef Mishnah says, he wasn't obliged to give the Maaser from the shalol, from the spoils. He did it on his own accord. There was no mitzvah for it. It is not the Geder mitzvah. It seems from the Ramban also, the Ramban al Torah. And therefore, the Rambam chooses to say, Dafka, the Yitzchak Hifresh Maaser, not Avram Hifresh Maaser. Like I say, if you'll get a chance, you'll look into other Mefarshei Rambam, and each one, many of them have a different take on exactly why the Rambam or the Rabbi say their way. Let's go on to the Rogatchover Gaon. The Rogatchover Gaon has a novel, Pirush and Biur, for this Hasagas Aravet, why the Ravid claims, what the Ravid claims l'chayra from an Aviyit's Pasuk. It says clearly in the Torah that Avram was Mafresh Maaser. So why Dafka does the Rambam say the Yitzchak Hifresh Maaser? Just before we go on for a moment, let me just also bring to your attention the Rashi on the spot. It's very clear from the Rashi. Rashi says, Vayiten loy Maaser Mekol. So look how Rashi says, Vayiten loy Avram. You see, Maaser Mekol asher loy lefisha hoya kohen. So what's interesting is as follows. We see from this Rashi a couple of points. This is brought in the Mefarshei HaMikra, and also, like I said, in the Rebbe's Likutei Sichos. Number one, when Rashi says, Vayiten loy Avram. Avram is the one who is giving the tithes. What is Rashi's intent? Rashi's intent is to be mapik, to exclude, to negate the pirush of the other Rishonim who say that the one who's giving the tithes is Shem ben Avram, Shem ben Noach. He's the one who's giving the tithes to Avram. No, it's Fakert. It's Avram who is giving it. So it's the Avram who is Mafresh Maaser. But then Rashi goes on to say, it says, Vayiten lo Maaser Mekol. What does Mekol mean? Mekol means from everything. That seems to be superfluous. So Rashi explains Mekol means, look what Rashi says, not just from the shalol, from the spoils after the war, after he's successful in winning the war, so the spoils, the booty, etc., the plunder, what he plunders, no. Rashi says, it says Mekol, Maaser Mekol asher loy. What is Mekol asher loy? From all of his belongings. All of his belongings mean, if you learn Parshas Lech Lecha, it says that Avram had mikne, he had much cattle, and he had soin, and he had kesed, vizov. So according to Rashi, he's giving Maaser, not just Maaser from the shalol, from the what he plundered, but he's also giving Mekol asher loy from all his belongings. He's even giving Maaser ksafim and incorporated in that. In other words, the Rabbi would learn Mekol asher, if he's going to learn, like Rashi says, that it's Mekol asher loy, everything which belonged to Avram. He's giving a section of that to the Kohen because, there are, we know the halacha is that Maaser, so there's Maaser Behemen, there's Maaser Karkois, but then there's also Maaser Ksafim. And that is right, you're giving a tenth from your income, which that's Lav Dafka D'Oraisis, the Rabbanon possibly. The Mela Lefizeh, nevertheless, that can be incorporated in what the Ravid says, Va'avrom, Hifresh Maaser, all different types of Maaser. Like Rashi says, Maaser Mekol asher loy, from all his belongings. Interesting what the Ponim Yafei says. The Ponim Yafei says, Mechadash a Chidush Gadol, and he wants to learn. And so he teaches also, he says in his Sefer Haflo, on Masechta Ksubis and Daf Nun, he's mechadish as follows, Mekol asher loy. So he says, what's happening? He has to give him from all his belongings, whatever belonged to Avram. And whatever he owns, he's giving Maaser tithes from to the Kohen. Why is he giving it now? Didn't he already give it in advance? Surely everything which he owned in advance, he surely already tithes before has given already Maaser from whatever he owns. Why is he giving it again now from everything he owns? It says, Vayiten loy Maaser Mekol. And especially according to Rashi, Mekol means Mekol asher loy. So the Panim Yafos is Mechadish in one of his Pirushim, and that's the way he accepts the same, the Haflah. In the Sefer Haflah, Masechta Ksubas Daf Nun has mentioned that because he's waging war against the four kings, and there's a very big possibility that he's not gonna be successful in winning the war. And if that's the case, the four kings are going to get him like he gets all the rest of the five kings. And if that's the case, all of what belonged to Avram will turn to nothing. Hashem makes a miracle, and Avram wins the war against the four mighty kings. The Mele, he says, Vibald, there's a possibility, there was an option during waging the war that Avram should lose all his belongings to these four kings, and then a miracle occurs, and he ends up keeping them, and he ends up having them. Mela says the haflo and his mechadish also in Panim Yafis that there's a new halacha that Avram gives Maaser Mekol from all his belongings which he had before the war. He already had given Maaser. Nevertheless, because in the interim, he's waging war, and there's a possibility he should lose everything he owns. And Hashem makes it a nest that he should now own and belong and keep on owning what he could have lost. Therefore, he's again giving Maaser. Mekol asher lo from all his belongings. Take a look at the Haflo, Masechet Ksubas Afnun, and also in the Panim Yafis. There are many different pirushim in this Mekol asher lo. We'll talk about another pirush as we'll go on further, mentioned by the Panim Yafis, which the fact is, as we'll see, the Rogatchover Gaon negates if time will allow for us to discuss it. So let's move on. It's very late. And the Rogatchover Gaon has his biur when the Rambam says v'yitzchak ifresh Maaser. Why doesn't he want to say what the Rivit says? The Rambam Dafke says Yitzchak, it's not Avram, which is mafresh Maaser. It's a mefurish pasuk like the Rivit claims. Just another point, I'm sorry I omitted. In the Rebbe in Likutei Sichos in volume 25 in Parshas Lech, when it says in the Chumash that Esav inquires by his father Yitzchak, if he had, how do you give Maaser from straw or salt? You remember that well-known Rashi. He tried to fool his father that he's frum. So there the Rebbe connects the two texts. There's a text of Rashi where Rashi says, how do you give Maaser? But in the Lashon of the Medrash, you don't find the Lashon of how do you give Maaser. The Rebbe wants to connect it with the Machloikis of the Rambam and the Rivit. So that's an interesting take and analysis on that Machloikis, on the two texts of the Medrash and the Rashi. So those who have a chance and an option, please take a look at Likutei Sichos, volume 25, Parshas Lech. We're moving on. The Rogatchover Gaon brings to our attention an interesting analysis, and this is the Rogatchover Gaon says this in Hilchas Matnas Aniyim in Perik Hey Halacha in Perik Zayin Halacha in Perik Zayin Halacha Hey, and Al Derech Zeh he says this in his commentary on Parshas Lech Lecha, and also in his in other places in his Sforim. Yeah, okay. And that is also in Parshas Matos. And this is as follows. The Rambam tells us, just a short introduction. It's not so short. It's going to be quite a lengthy introduction. There's a machloikis of the Rambam and the Bahag. In other words, the machloikis is based on how the Rambam understood this Bahag. And this is as follows. The Rambam in the third principle, the Rambam presents 14. The Rambam appreciated the number 14 as is known, and that's why the Rambam introduces 14 principles, 14 shoroshim before the Sefer HaMitzvahs as an introduction to Sefer HaMitzvahs, and also his Sefer Mishneh Torah also incorporates 14 Sforim. That's why it's called, also named Yad HaChazaka. It has the 14 Sforim. I'll call upon him. Let's move on. So in the third principle, in the Shirish Gimel, the third principle, in this third introduction to the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam tells us a known thing, which is already brought by other Rishonim. For instance, as the Rashbatz, Rab Shimon ben Semach, in his Sefer Zohar HaRokiah, we're going to talk about what he has to say on this topic. So he also has a synopsis of the Rambam's Shoroshim in his work called Zohar HaRokiah, which are comments, he authored a sefer on the poetry of Rabbi Shlomo ibn Gabirul, who recorded all the mitzvahs of the Torah in a mode of in a poetic way, and he incorporates all the mitzvahs, Taryag mitzvahs of Esse and Lois Esse, and on that the sefer, the Rab Shimon ben Samach, the Tashbetz, wrote a sefer called Zohar HaRokiah with many refutes. We refutes the sheet of Rab Shimon ibn Gabirul, which generally follows in the sheet of the Baal Halachas Gedolos. Let's move on. So the Rambam tells us in the third principle that what do we count? We know there are 613 mitzvahs, as the Gemara says in Masechet Makos. The Gemara says that there are Taryag mitzvahs shenitna l'Moshe miSinai, and the Gemara says we derive it from the pasuk. It says Torah tziva lonu Moshe Merosha Kehilas Yankev. Torah b'gematria Tov Reish Yud Aleph. The numerical value of Torah is Tov Reish Yud Aleph. That's 611. And the Gemara says those first two dibros of the the first of the 10 commandments, words from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So altogether is 613, and that was Nitna L'Moshe Sinai. That's what the Gemara says in Masechta Makos. It says the Rambam based on this text of the Gemara. Nitna L'Moshe Sinai, because we base it on Sinai, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave at Sinai, and all those mitzvahs that Hashem said at Sinai on Nitzchim. And therefore he says, based on that text, it teaches us that we only incorporate and enumerate in the Taryag mitzvah, in the mitzvahs, only mitzvahs hanoi hagois ledoros, only mitzvahs which are which are commandments and mandates for generations, but mitzvahs which don't apply for generations. They were just commandments which HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe Rabbeinu commanded Am Yisrael in Mitzrayim, and it only related to Mitzrayim. Or there are certain mitzvahs which HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe Rabbeinu commanded Am Yisrael whilst Yidden were in the Midbar, and they related only to the time when the Yidden were in the Midbar. So those mitzvahs are defined as mitzvahs which are not noiheg ledoros, they are not for generations, meaning once Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael and the like. So therefore, even though it's clear that they are commandments and they are mitzvahs, they will not be part of the Taryag mitzvahs, the meaning of the Sefer HaMitzvahs, of the Minyan HaMitzvahs, of the number of 613. And therefore, and the Rambam goes on to say it also, we know it from the Lashon Torah, Tziva Lana Moshe, Moirosha Kehilas Yaakov. Moirosha would mean it's an inheritance, and an inheritance is what? Something which is for generations, and it's for eternity, it's eternal, and therefore it has to be dafka such mitzvahs, which are Moirosha Kehilas Yaakov, which are mitzvahs which are for generations, not which were limited to any specific time and space. He goes on to say, therefore, we must say that mitzvahs which are not noyeg l'doros cannot be part and parcel of the 613 mitzvahs, even though they were mitzvahs for the time, because then we would have many, many more mitzvahs, 300 additional mitzvahs, hundreds of mitzvahs, additional mitzvahs, etc. in the number, and there's no 613. And B'mela, therefore, he disagrees, he dislikes, he has the number and the way he sees that in the Parshas, in other words, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, one of the Gaonim, he seems to enumerates the mitzvahs, which we count as part of the 613 mitzvahs. And the fact is that the Rambam understands that many of the mitzvahs, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, counts as in the number of the 613, they are what? It's also the mitzvahs which aren't noheg l'doros. And therefore, the Rambam says, oh boy, the Bahag is of that opinion that he counts also mitzvahs which are not noheg l'doros. He says, therefore, I don't agree with him and I disagree with him and we can't do that. And therefore, he refutes the shita of the Bahag of the Baal Halachas Gedolos, and he concludes, we only count mitzvahs which are noheg l'doros. In the eyes of the Rambam, the Bahag counted in the number of 613 also mitzvahs which are not for generations, which do not relate and are not mandated for generations. Comes the Ramban, and the Ramban in general, Nachmanides also wrote a commentary, refutes Hasagas HaRamban on the Rambam, on Maimonides, and therefore in the Sefer HaMitzvahs on the Shirish Gimel, the Ramban protects the Baal Halachas Gedolos, and many of the refutes of the Rambam of the Bahag, the Ramban protects the Bahag. It doesn't mean to say he accepts the opinion of the Bahag, because in other words, the Ramban also agrees that we only count in the Minyan HaMitzvahs only mitzvahs which are noheg l'doros, and he comes up with an interesting thing. Those mitzvahs which the Rambam is under the impression that they are mitzvahs which are not noheg l'doros, and therefore the Bahag counts them, and therefore he argues on him, says the Ramban, you're mistaken, you're misinterpreting the approach of the Bahag. The Bahag, the reason why he counts them in the Minyan HaMitzvahs, in the number of the mitzvahs, is because he accepted that this mitzvah or these mitzvahs are noheg l'doros. They do apply for generations. They are commandments for eternity. And let's therefore focus on one of the mitzvahs. And this is a mitzvah which is called Trumas Meches. Trumas Meches. And that is Trumas Meches means the tribute tithe. That's the way they translate it if you want an English translation. Trumas Meches means the tribute tithe. Where do we find Trumas Meches? And for that, we need a chumash in Parshas Matos. Take out your Parshas Matos, and when Yidden were commanded to Moshe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded Moshe Rabbeinu that Yidden should wage war against the Midianites, being because the Midyanim caused the Yidden to sin with their daughters. The Mela, therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, take revenge from the Midyanim. And there's a detailed description in the description of the war which they wage against the Midyanim and how they have to prepare for war and what happens after the war. It concludes. And in the conclusion of the war, we read a lengthy description in the Chumash about Trumas Meches, and that is as follows. There was a lot of plunder. They plundered a lot of all the property. We're not talking about movable objects. We're talking about human beings, that both males, females, and slaves, etc., etc. So there's loads of men and women which was plundered from the Midianites. So the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe Rabbeinu says the women have to be killed, etc. Take out your Chumash, Parshas Matos. Whatever was left over, which ends up being what what was plundered. So the booty, the spoils, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's what the Yidden can keep. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says as follows: all the spoils should be split in half. We should count up all the spoils from the Midyanim. Count them and split them in half. After you count them all up, split them in half. What about it? One half you should give to the soldiers who went in battle, and the other half you should give to the rest of the people who didn't participate in the battle. And then Moshe Rabbeinu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu as follows: that from the half which are given, from the half of the spoils which are given to those who went to battle, you should take 1 of 500 of every type and species, and they should give trumas meches. They should give tribute tithe away, and they should give it to who? To the Elazar HaKohen, to the Kohen Gadol, to Elazar, who was at the time the Kohen Gadol. Val derech zeh, from the half of the people who stayed behind and didn't take part in the battle. So they also had half of the spoils. So their half, you should take 1 of 50 from their spoils, 1 of 50 from all types and all the different species, and they should give it away as a what? As a trumas meches to the Levim, to the Levites. And at the end in the parsha, it says, take out your Chumash, Parshas Matos. It says that at the end they end up, the heads. The what do you call it? Vizakmandas. So the Torah says they did so and they split it up and everything was fulfilled. And then it says at the end that the commanders of the army and the officers, etc., they say to Moshe so and so exactly how the success was in the war, and then they end up bringing to his attention that there were there was gold vessels and bracelets and jewelry and earrings, etc., etc. And Moshe Rabbeinu takes all of the gold, right? Moshe Rabbeinu takes all of the gold and consecrates it. They bring all of the gold to Hashem into the Mishkan, etc., etc. Take out your Chumash. So we have a whole story in Parshas Matos which speaks about Trumas Meches. The Mela, so the Bahag counts mitzvah, Trumas Meches, as part and parcel of the 613 mitzvahs. It's part of the 613 mitzvahs. In other words, every war which is optional, which the Am Yisrael raises and wages against the enemy. So when there are spoils, they have to give some of the spoils to who? To Elazar HaKohen, to the Levim, to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Mishkan, etc., etc. So the Rambam says, Trumas Meches. Trumas Meches is not a mitzvah l'deiros. Trumas Meches was only commanded for the Midyanim, only the time of the war with Midyan, and it's not a mitzvah sheneig l'deiros. Therefore, what the Bahag counts as one of the mitzvahs, he's wrong. Comes the Ramban. Nachmanides says as follows. He protects the Rambam, and he claims that no, the Rambam misinterpreted the Bahag. The Bahag also agrees that we only count mitzvahs which are nohig l'deiros, which are for all generations. It's just that he holds that the mitzvah of Trumas Meches, to give this tribute tithe, right, also is meant for all generations. And this parsha of Matos, with a lengthy description of giving the Trumas Meches, is described to teach us for generations, that in every milchama is a reshus. I'm reading some texts of the Ramban, and every optional war, so there's a mitzvah to bring from the spoils a truma Hashem, and he brings a pasuk like we find by David in Divrei Hayamim. The Ramban brings in Divrei Hayamim, we read in Kapitel Aleph pasuk Yudches, Kapitel Yudches, Divrei Hayamim Aleph, Kapitel Yudches. It says umitivchas umikun orei hadad ezer lokar David nechoishes rabba ma'oid. The spoils were many, a lot of copper. And what did we do with the copper? Also shloimes yam nechoishes. He made the yam, the ocean, the copper vessel to hold the water in the Beis Hamikdash, ves klei nechoishes. And he made all the copper vessels from the copper which was plundered from the wars. And also further on, says the Ramban, it says in Divrei Hayamim, Gam Oisam Higdish HaMelech David LaHashem. Moshe Rabbeinu also took all the other vessels, the gold and the silver and the copper vessels with the gold and the silver. And what did he do? He also brought it to the Beis Hamikdash. The Mela says the Ramban, here we see that David followed this message, and that is the message which is taken out from Parshas Matos, that you have to give Trumas Mechas Lashem. So it's actually a mitzvah hanoyeg l'dorah. So therefore, what the Rambam argues of the Bahag is of no avail, because he also holds that we can't mitzvah hanoyeg l'dorah, and it is a mitzvah which applies l'dorah. And the Ramban concludes. He says, take out a Chumash, a very interesting pasuk. Listen to what it says in the Chumash. In the end of Parshas Matos, take out your Chumash. It says, "Vayikach Moshe ve'Elazar haKohen es Azov." Excuse me. Sorry, ha'alofim va'ameis. Vayavi oisei Eloel moed. It says that Moshe and Elazar take all the gold from the commanders and the officers, and they bring it to the Mishkan. Zikaron levnei Yisrael lefnei Hashem, a remembrance for the children of Israel before Hashem. Says the Ramban in Sefer HaMitzvahs. Look what it says. It says Zikaron levnei Yisrael lefnei Hashem. Now, if this was merely a private donation, which they weren't mandated in doing, so why does it say Zikaron levnei Yisrael lefnei Hashem? When it says Zikaron levnei Yisrael lefnei Hashem, that conveys to us that is a special remembrance for all of Klal Yisrael. And when is it a remembrance for all of Klal Yisrael? When it's for generations. So that conveys and that reflects what the Baal Halachas Gdolos teaches us, that we actually, the pasuk itself in Parshas Matos tells us and brings to our attention, and it reflects what the Bahag says, that we have to do this as a mitzvah for generations. So that's the way the Ramban reconciles this Bahag from the questions and the refutes of the Rambam. Also, interestingly, Rav Shavel already in his commentary in Chumash, in the Ramban, take out a Ramban ala Torah, also on this pasuk, Zikaron levnei Yisrael. So he also says, and like the Ramban, I didn't mention it before, the Ramban says that they made from this clay shores, they actually made vessels which served the base in the Mishkan. So it wasn't just placed away in the treasury of the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan. We actually made clay shores, which we serve. We serve communal karbonos, which we serve the Am Yisrael. So the Mela, the Ramban says the same thing on a Chumash, which substantiates the sheet of the Bahag. Even though the Ramban himself agrees that we don't count it as one of the 613 mitzvahs. He doesn't count the mitzvah of Trumas Meches as one of the 613 mitzvahs as the Bahag counts. Nevertheless, he reconciles the question of the Rambam of the Bahag. That's what he does on behalf of the Bahag. Now, so everything sounds good. Kommt again. Now, what I want to say is as follows. Here comes the Rogatchover with his novel reconciliation. The Rogatchover Gaon says that when it says in the Chumash, let's go back to the Chumash. It says, Vayiten loy Maaser Mekol. When is Avraham Avinu giving the Maaser? That's after he wages war with the 4 kings, right? The 5 against the 4, and now therefore he's waging war. The 4 win over the 5, and then he's going to get back Lot and all his property from these 4 kings, for Sodom and Amorah, etc. So the Torah says yes. So there's a whole description how Avraham Avinu is waging the war with Eliezer, etc., etc. Torah says in detail exactly how many men, the Shmoina Asur, there are 318. Yes, 318 men fighting war against these four big kings and their armies. Rashi says that it may have not been even 318 men. It may just be him and Eliezer. So everything was miraculous, but Al Koponim, he wins the war. And therefore he's successful and he comes back, and therefore they're celebrating, and therefore Shem brings out lechem v'yoyin, and Rashi says that was the custom, that whoever was exhausted from the war, so they bring out and they present wine and bread. There's another pshat in the Rashi, and then it says at the end, Vayiten Maaser Mekol. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, Vayiten Maaser Mekol. So the truth is, in principle, we find this already in the Kesef Mishnah, in the Mefarshei Rambam, Kesef Mishnah Radvaz, that the Maaser he's giving, the tithe he is giving to the Kohen, is such tithe which is from the sholol, from the plunder, what was plundered, the booty, right, and the spoils. Oh boy, but here we come to an interesting take of the Rogatchover Gaon. It's not stam sholol like the Kesef Mishnah and the Ravid say, and the Radvaz say. It is sholol, that is the trumas meches, says the Rogatchover Gaon. What Avraham Avinu is doing here, he is doing something, he's performing a mitzvah, which is dugma, which is begeder. That's the criteria of the trumas meches according to the Bahag. That's what the Chumash is conveying. In other words, the Bahag says that just like there's a din of mitzvah of trumas meches in the case of Midian, the same applies by all wars which are any war which is waged against the enemy. The Mela Avraham Avinu is also performing this mitzvah of trumas meches, that after there are spoils, he's taking a 10 tithes from these spoils, and just like in the case of Midian, there was 1 of 500 or 1 of 50. So here too, he's giving a section to the Kohen Leil Elyon. Says the Rogatchover Gaon. That's the way the Rambam understood the psukim. And B'meila says the Rogatchover Gaon, because the Rambam disagrees with the Baal Halachos Gdolos, like we just said in Sheresh Gimel. The Baal Halachos Gdolos holds that it's a mitzvah l'doros, but the Rambam disagrees with the Bahag. He holds the mitzvah of Trumas Meches is a mitzvah which is not for all generations. That was only a one-off by Midian. The Mela also, the Rambam, who when he learns Parshas Lech Lecha and he sees Avram is mafresh Maaser, it's not Maaser from Karka, it's not Maaser from Behema, it's Maaser from the Sholol, from the spoils. That's bedugma, that's the geder, that's the criteria of Trumas Meches of Midian. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, because the Rambam is of the opinion that is a mitzvah which is not noyeg l'doros, not for generations. That's why he doesn't mention it in Hilchas Melachim. In Hilchas Melachim, he mentions mitzvahs which were kept before Matan Torah, which those mitzvahs will be performed for generations. Take a look at all the different mitzvahs the Rambam mentions. We don't have to go over it again. You'll see those mitzvahs are mentioned because all those mitzvahs will eventually be mitzvahs for generations. The Rambam only tells us who kept them before Matan Torah, and we keep them because Moshe Rabbeinu commanded us after Matan Torah. But the Rambam Dafka doesn't mention that Avram hifresh Maaser, because the Maaser Avram is separating, is giving, is performing, is such a mitzvah which is not loyeg l'doros. He doesn't hold like the Bahag. The Mela, therefore, he doesn't say Avram hifresh Maaser. He therefore says Yitzchak hifresh Maaser. But why? Because the Maaser Yitzchak is mafresh, is such a mitzvah which is noyeg l'doros, which is continuous for generations, because it's either Maaser Behema, like we mentioned, or it's Maaser Karkois, like it says in the Rashi from the Medrash that Oimid Zela Maaser is the assessment from the karka, from the harvest, was what from the crop was for Maaser's sake. That's the take of the Rogatchover Gaon. Interestingly, Rabbi Yerucham Fischel Perla, known with his kalas, which is gewaldige chibur on the Sefer HaMitzvos Laharasag, or Rabbi Sadia Gaon, who came from Lithuania and was a Rav in Varsha for many years, and then he made the Aliyah Eretz Yisrael. So he explains he wrote a commentary on the Sefer Kafter Vaferach from the Rishonim. Unfortunately, we only have his commentary on 5 chapters of the Sefer Kafter Vaferach, one of the Rishonim, which Lamaisa B'Pel for generations. This Sefer Kafter Vaferach wasn't available, wasn't accessible, it wasn't the Ksav Yad, but in the days of the Beis Yosef, it became accessible, it was then published, and then the Gdolei Yisrael, in the time of the Beis Yosef, reference it, and Achroinim thereafter reference it, a very choshev Sefer, a mitzvahs at Luis Ba'aretz, which relate to Eretz Yisrael, etc., etc. So he wrote a commentary on the whole of the Kafter Vaferach, And the Maaser that Rav Kook published only the 5 on the first 5 chapters. Unfortunately, the Chibur, which he penned and authored on the whole rest of the Kafta V'Ferach, which contains many, many chapters, were taken back with his son, who went back to Europe, and unfortunately was lost after the war. So the Ksavim of Rabbi Yochanan Fischel and the other chapters of the Kafta V'Ferach were lost. So was written in the introduction on his sefer called Pirchei Tzion on the Kafta V'Ferach. So there too, that's his take. He also says this reconciliation on his own without bringing no Rogatchover, but he brings it on his own, this pshat. What he does he goes a step further, and he says the reason why the Ravid argues on the Rambam, and the reason why the Ravid says that the Rambam should have written Avram Hifrish Maaser, so he takes it a step further, and he says, yes, the reason why it should have said Avram Hifrish Maaser is because the Ravid's opinion is like the Bahag. The Bahag holds that it's a mitzvah l'doros to separate Trumas Meches l'doros, and therefore the Ravid says we can't say Avram Hifrish Maaser. Okay, so that explains the Rambam, but let's go on. The Rogatchover Gaon in his on Hilchas Matnas Aniyim and also in his commentary on Chumash says I actually have a raya to the Rambam. Not like the Bahag, that the mitzvah of Trumas Meches, giving tithes, giving from the spoils of what we gain, what we earn from the war, from waging war. I have a Mefurish Gemara. It says a Mefurish Gemara in Masechta Menachos Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Beis, where the Gemara says that this is not a mitzvah for eternity. It's not Noeg L'Doros. And the Rogatchover brings a Mefurish Gemara. The Gemara says in Masechta Menachos Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Beis, says the Gemara as follows. The Gemara there discusses the Korban Toida. We know the Korban Toida. We have to give the Korban Toida in addition to the animal which was brought, the sacrifice which is brought on the altar. We have to bring also matzah and challah, which we have to bring to the Beis Hamikdash. A section had to be given to the Kohen, with 4 types of different types of challahs and matzahs, 4 types, some were chomet, some were matzah, and there were 4 different kinds, and we have to give one of the 4 kinds, from all of the 4 kinds, we have to give to the kohen, and the rest, the owners of the korban toida, eat and consume, and it has a din of what? Of kochim kalim. Okay, all good. The Gemara queries, how many challahs does the Torah have to comprise of? The Torah only says that we have to have some loaves, which have to loaves, plural, many loaves. The question is how many loaves of chametz, how many loaves of matzah, how many loaves? There's no number mentioned in the Torah. The Torah says one of the loaves have to be given to the Kohen. But how many loaves do we have to have initially? So the Gemara originally says, how do we know? We know it from Trumas Maaser. Trumas Maaser. It says by Trumas Maaser, the din is, right, that we have to give truma. In other words, we separate from the crop, we give an amount, either 1 out of 40, or 1 out of 50, or 1 out of 60. We give to the kohen, and then we have to, now we get out of the kohen, and then we have to give a tithe, a tenth of the harvest to the Levi, a tenth of the harvest to the Levi. Now, once the Levi receives his tenth, the Torah says that he has to give Trumas Maaser. He has to give Truma right from his Maaser. Okay, Trumas Maaser. So he has to give a shear from 10, a section from 10. So the Gemara says the Truma of the Levi to the Kohen is Trumas Maaser. That's 1 of 10. From there we know that also the Korban Toida, because it has the same expression, it uses the Lashon Truma LaHashem. So therefore the Korban Toida also has to be 1 of 10. Therefore every type, there are 4 types of challahs and matzahs. So therefore there were 40 altogether. So you have to give 4 challahs, 4 matzahs, 4 challahs and matzah to the kohen, and all the rest belongs to the owners, and they consume it. So they only have to bring 4 because you have to bring a tenth. So the tenth is derived from Trumas Maaser. Asks the Gemara, why do you derive it from Trumas Maaser? The Gemara has a lengthy discussion, and then the Gemara says, why don't we derive it from Trumas Midyon? By Trumas Midyon, they also didn't give a tenth. It was either, right? It was, and Rashi says 1 out of 50. We mentioned before that for the people who stayed behind, they had to give Trumas Mechas was 1 out of 50 or 1 out of 500. So the Gemara says maybe let's derive it from Trumas Midyan. Why do we say we derive it from Trumas Maaser? So the Gemara says no, we only derive Doros Midoros, mitzvahs which are relate for generations. We derive from mitzvahs which relate to derive from generations. So because Trumas Maaser and Korban Todah are mitzvahs for generations, therefore we derive one from the other. But the Trumas Midyan is not for generations. It's only l'shah. Trumas Midyan is not l'doros. So it's a Mefurish Gemara, says the Rambam. I have a Mefurish Gemara which substantiates the approach of the Rambam that Trumas Meches of Midyan was only for Midyan and it doesn't apply anywhere else. And that's why the Rambam disagrees with the Bahag and he doesn't count it of the 613 mitzvahs. And that's why the Rambam says V'yitzchak Hifrish Maaser and he doesn't say Avram Hifrish Maaser. Okay, all good. Now the Zohar Harakia, the Tashbats, in his commentary on the Azhoros from Rab Shlomo Ibn Gabirol, in his mitzvahs, he brings this Ramban who reconciles the Bahag, right? The Ramban substantiated the Baal Halachas Gedolos, and he says the Baal Halachas Gedolos makes sense, and the Baal Halachas Gedolos is of the opinion that it is L'Doros, and he brings proof from David HaMelech. That's number one. Number two, he brings proof from a Chumash. It says Zikaron L'Bnei Yisrael Zikaron L'Bnei Yisrael L'Fnei Hashem. So from the Chumash we see that it's something for generations. That's what the Ramban said. If you recall, we can't repeat it. So hopefully you'll listen to the recording. You'll remember exactly what the Ramban says. We're going on. It's getting very late. Okay, quick. Says the Zohar Rakia. How can the Ramban say what he says? And listen to the stern language he uses on the Ramban. Rab Shimon Bar Tzemach was one of the Rishonim, but he says in the Ramban, Dvarav Einam Emes. The words of the Ramban aren't true. Why aren't they true? He says, you know why? Two reasons. Number one, he says, I have a Mefurish Gemara in Masechta Menachos, where the Gemara says that Trumas Mechas of Midyan is not Noheg L'Doros. It's not Noheg L'Doros. In other words, the proof the Rogatchover brought for the Rambam to say that it doesn't apply for generations, the Zohar Rakia, the Rashbats, uses that taka to refute the Bahag. And he says, I have a clear Gemara against the Ramban who wants to substantiate the Bahag, that it does apply. And that's the reason why the Ravid says, Avram Hifrish Maaser, because that mitzvah is l'doros for generations. And that's what David is implementing, like it says in the Divrei Hayamim. He says, the Gemara says clearly in Masechta Menachos that it's not noheg l'doros. That's one kasha the Tashbetz has on the Ramban on the Bahag. Another kasha he says, what is he talking about? The Ramban, when he take out a Chumash, he says in the Chumash, there are 3 sections in the Parshas Matis Bamidyon. One section is the Trumas Meches, is one of the 500 that we're giving those from the different species we're giving to the Kohen. Then we have a section that's 1 out of 50, which we're giving to the Levi. Then at the end of it all, the generals and the officers say to Moshe Rabbeinu that we have plundered loads of gold and silver and copper, etc., and jewelry. And Moshe Rabbeinu says you should bring that all to bring for you as an atonement. Why? What kind of atonement do they need? Because they were waging war against the Midianites. So they may have at some stage been maharer, that having bad thoughts about the women and thinking about the women, the Midianites women. So for that, they need an atonement. And therefore, they're bringing this atonement. And they're bringing it to the Mishkan. So Zohar Rakia says, you know where it says that this is a Zikaron L'Bnei Yisrael L'Fnei Hashem? The Zikaron L'Fnei Hashem is the carbon they end up bringing at the end of the day. The officers and the commanders are bringing all the jewelry to Hashem, and we make from it vessels, consecrated vessels. That's the carbon L'Fnei Hashem, and that is for generations. But the Trumas Meches, and that is the tribute of the tithe, it doesn't say Zikaron L'Bnei Yisrael. That pasuk doesn't relate to that. So what is the Ramban saying? That based on this pasuk, that is a proof for the Bahag that it should be for generations. That does not relate back to the Trumas Meches. It only relates and connects to the korban at the end of the day, which the commanders and the officers bring, but not to the one of the 500 and one of the 50. That's the kash of the Zohar Rakia. The Noda Yehuda, it's very late. The Noda Yehuda in his response. The Noda Yehuda in his response in Yeridea, Madura Tinyana Yeridea, Seif Simon Reish Aleph. So the Rabbi Yeshaya Berlin, known as Rabbi Yeshaya Pick, asks the kasha to the Noda Yehuda. He says, what's going on? I don't understand. He says, in my Shas, I have a Gemara Masechta Menachos, and it says in Rashi says, when the Gemara wanted to derive that how many loaves of challah bread does the korban toida need to contain? Says the Gemara, let's derive it from where? From Midian. Says Rashi, from which part of Midian? From the 1 of 50. In other words, the Gemara says, it has to be 1 of 10. Says the Gemara, let's learn it out from Midian, it's 1 of 50. Asks Rabbi Shaya Berlin to the Noda Yehuda. Why, when the Gemara says that we should derive it from the spoils of Midian, we want to derive it from the 1 of 50? Why not from the 1 of 500? There were 2 types of trumas mechas at the time. There were for the section of the soldiers, which their half, they had to give half of the people who didn't go to battle. So they had to give 1 of 50 to the Leviim. The Gemara says, according to Rashi, that we should derive that the amount of loaves by the korban tamid should be derived from 1 of 50. Asks Rabbi Shai Berlin, why 1 of 50? Why not 1 of 500? Answers the Noda Yehuda as follows. He says, the 1 of 50 is really unusual. The whole 1 of 50 doesn't even make sense. Because why should the people who don't go to battle and they don't take part of the battle whatsoever, and they don't even stay behind to protect the gear, they should get also part of the spoils? And he explains, the Noda Yehuda says, we find by David HaMelech that David HaMelech was masakin a special takona, especially instituted, that even those who don't go to battle will take part in a share of the spoils. But which people who don't go to battle, at least they participated in some way. They at least protected the gear, even though they didn't go to battle. And Rashi brings it in Chumash, in Parshas Lech Lecha. Take a look at Rashi in the sequence of the story with Avraham Avinu and Zdaim and Amor. Look at some Rashi. Says the Noda Yehuda, that makes sense. But to give them part of the spoils, if they don't go and take part of the battle at all, and they don't take part of protecting the gear at all, why should they bechlal take part in it? So the Noda Yehuda explains the reason they take part in it is not because, it says only because by them we found an interesting expression. It says in the Chumash, Echad ochuz min hachamishim. Ochuz. It's an unusual, ochuz means a percentage. That loshen is an unusual expression. It says in Noda Yehuda, it says in Talmud Yerushalmi in Masechta Trumas Perek Daled Halacha Gimel, that whenever you're unsure how much you're meant to set aside for tithes, so we take an ochuz min hachamishim. You always take the middle, the intermediate, the medium, the normal. That means 1 of 40 is a rasha. 1 of 60, in other words, 1 of 40 is one level, 1 of 60 is another level, 1 of 50 is the Beinuni, is the normal amount. So that's the meaning. It says over there, Echad ochos ben hachamishim. That's what the Gemara chose to say, that we know it from the 1 of 50, not of the 1 of 500. And on that, the Gemara concludes that that's not nohig l'dairos. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, says the Noda Yehuda. When the Gemara says, in relation to the korban, the trumas mechas of Midian, that it's not for eternity. It's only l'sho. It's not l'doros. It's only referring to the 1 of 50, because really, in essence, they should have never gotten it in the first place. And that the Gemara says it's not l'doros, and there the Bahag will also agree it's not l'doros. But on the section of the 1 of the 500, which is from the half, the percentage which is taken, the 1 of 500 is taken from those who went to battle. That is the trumas mechas for the ones who went to battle. They get a section of the spoils that the Bahag will hold that is l'doros, and that the Gemara never addressed. That's after the Zohar Harakia says that what the Ramban says on behalf of the Bahag is not true, and he has two refutations. He refutes him, number one from a Gemara, and number two from the Chumash. The Gemara says clearly, not like the Ramban on behalf of the Bahag. The Ramban on behalf of the Bahag said that the mitzvah of Trumas Meches is Ledoiros. The Gemara says in Menachas Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Beis, page 77b, that it's not Ledoiros, without going into the details of the Gemara again. And the Chumash, where it says, where the Ramban said, because it says Zikorin Levnei Yisrael Lefnei Hashem, that conveys to us that it is for eternity. That's why it's a Zikorin, a remembrance for the Klal Yisrael. And that's why they made clay shores out of it. They made consecrated vessels to do the service of the Beis HaMikdash. That tells us that what is discussed in the Parsha is for eternity. Says the Zohar Harakia, that does not apply to the details of the above mentioned details. It doesn't relate to the Trumas Meches of 1 out of 500. It doesn't relate to the Trumas Meches of 1 of 50. It only relates to the last section of the officers and the commanders who claimed that they needed an atonement, etc. And therefore, they're bringing it to the Beis HaMikdash. That korban was an atonement. And that is a zikoron, a remembrance for generations. And therefore, the Zohar Harakia concludes that Taka, the Bahag, is wrong. The Ramban is wrong on behalf of the Bahag. And the Ramban himself, Taka, agrees to the Rambam that we don't count it as one of the 613 mitzvahs because it is Taka not for generations. And we mentioned the Noidei B'Yehuda. The Noidei B'Yehuda, without again repeating all the details, he says that there's a difference between the 1 of 50 or the 1 of 500. The Trumas Meches, which is 1 of 50, that doesn't apply for generations. Because in essence, essentially, the whole thing is out of hand. Why should they at all get a part of the spoils? They didn't do any. They weren't participating in the battle. They weren't even participating in protecting the gear which were needed for the battle. Therefore, that is what the Gemara relates and addresses to that Trumas Meches. That doesn't apply for generations. But the Trumas Meches, 1 of 500, which that is the tribute type, which is given by the soldiers to the Koyanim, that does apply for generations, and the Gemara never negated that. And that is the opinion of the Bahag and the Ramban. That's the reconciliation of the Noidei B'Yehuda and Yeridei Simerei Shalaf and Madura Tinyona. Now, Rabbi Yerucham Fishel Perlo, in his Sefer, in his monumental work, in Sefer HaMitzvahs on Rab Sadia Gaon, in the last section, which is called the Parshios. So in the last section in volume 3, on Parsha Samach Hey, the 65th Parsha, he brings all of this to our attention. He brings the Rambam to our attention. He brings the Bahag to our attention. He brings the Ramban to our attention. He brings the Zohar Harakia to our attention. And he brings the Noidei B'Yehuda to our attention. And he lashes out at the Noidei B'Yehuda. And he says, sorry, the Noidei B'Yehuda is off track. What he says is insufficient and not good enough. Number one, he says an interesting thing. He says he claimed to make a distinction between the 1 of 50 and 1 of 500. And he says the Gemara in Menachos is addressing the 1 of 50. Well, sorry, says the Rabbi Yerucham Fishel Perlo in his Biur. He says, you'll take out the Rashi Ksav Yad. Now, you'll take out a Gemara Menachos, a standard Gemara Menachos Daf Ayin Zayin. You will see that there is a standard Rashi, which is published in your standard Vilna Shas. Then you'll find a lower down, it says Rashi Ksav Yad, Rashi from the manuscript. Okay, so Rashi in the Vilna Shas, your standard Rashi says 1 of 50. That's what the Gemara is discussing. But the Rashi in the manuscript says 1 of 500. How do you like that? That's what the Gemara is addressing. And that is the basis of the Zohar Harakia's question. He says, take a look at the words of the Zohar Arakia. When he refutes the Bahag and the Ramban, he says, he's talking about the text of Rashi Ksav, which that was the text he had. And on that, he understood that the Gemara says that the 1 of 500 is not for generations. And on that, he refutes the Bahag and the Ramban. In other words, what the Neder Yehoshua wanted to say, that the 1 of 500 is for generations, and the 1 of 50 is not for generations. He says, the Zohar Arakia had a text which read that the 1 of the 500 is not for generations. So what the Neder Yehoshua says is insufficient. So even though his pshat sounds like very nice, and it seems to fit, but that fits only for the Rashi and the Vilna Shas, but not in the Rashi of the manuscript, which has 1 of 500. And even though Rabbeinu Gershom also says like the Rashi in the Vilna Shas, and the Tosfos in Masechta Yuma, Daf Chav Dalet, page 24a, also clearly brings the Talmud Yerushalmi of Masechta Trumos, Perek Dalet Halacha Gimel, where there it says that we're discussing the 1 of 50, and he says, therefore, when the Gemara in Masechta Yuma also discusses the 1 of the Trumas Midyan, that's another Gemara, an interesting Gemara, and that is, so let's just finish with the Gemara in Menachos. So basically he says, number 1, he says, you want to say the 1 of 500 is for generations? Well, according to the Rashi of the manuscript and the text of the Zohar Arakia, even that states that, according to that, the Gemara also relates to that, and the Gemara also says that is not for generations. So the whole pshat of the Bahag is refuted. That's number 1. Number 2, he also goes into the in-depth, the nitty-gritty of what the Neder Yehoshua says. He wants to draw distinctions between the Trumas Mechas of 150 and 1,500. He says you can't draw any distinctions. You're all wrong. If 1 out of 50 doesn't apply for generations, the same should apply for 1 out of the 500. Take a look at the Neder Yehoshua of the works of the Rabbi Yerucham Fishel Perla. He explains himself. And the third main refute is as follows. He says, the Zohar Arakia concludes, and this is where he refutes the Zohar Arakia. He says the Zohar Arakia refutes the Bahag and the Ramban by saying that the Posuk at the end of the Parsha relates not to the Trumas Mechas, but it relates to the Korbanos. And he says, and the mitzvah, which is for generations, the Bahag holds his Trumas Mechas. He says he got it all wrong. He says the fact is that the Bahag will also agree that what is for generations? Only the last section, only the korban, which has to be brought to the Beis Hamikdash, that's what relates for generations. In other words, the 1 out of 8 of 500, or the 1 out of 50, the Bahag will also agree doesn't apply for generations. What applies for generations is only what we learn at the end of the Parsha. That's what the Ramban wants to say. So he says the Zohar Arakia doesn't understand the Ramban. The Ramban wants to be machadash and tell us that what is for generations? Only the korban which is addressed at the end, where there it says Zikaron Levnei Yisrael. And therefore, that is also the opinion of the Bahag, he says. And therefore, when the Gemara says that Trumas Mechas doesn't apply for generations, even if it refers to the 1 out of 500, 1 out of 50, nevertheless, it can still be counted as one of the 613 mitzvahs because it's relating to what the officers and the generals are bringing at the end of the parsha in Parshas Midyan. I just want to also mention that Rabbi Akiva Eger and also the Rogatchover Gaon tell us that in Masechta Menachos, there they have a gloss which sends us off to Gemara Masechta Yuma. The Gemara Masechta Yuma Daf Chav Daled Amud Aleph, there it discusses also the amount of Trumas Hadesh, and we know daily it was a mitzvah to separate the ash, right? To take a section of the ash, which was on top of the altar, and remove it from, that's the mitzvah of Trumas Hadesh. So the question is, how much ash has to be removed from the deshen? And the Gemara says, should we derive it from Trumas Maaser, that it should be 1 of 10, or should we derive it from Trumas Midyan? Again, the Gemara mentions Trumas Midyan. Now, the Gemara concludes that we don't derive it from Trumas Maaser, which is a 10th, 1 of 10. We don't either derive it from Trumas Midyan. We derive it from the koimetz of the Menachos, from a total, a third din. That's all good. But we see initially the Gemara wants to allow itself to derive a mitzvah for generations, which is the mitzvah of Trumas Adeshen, from where? From Trumas Midyan. So interesting there, Rashi says, according to all the Rashis, there Rashi says 1 of 500. In other words, the Gemara wanted to derive a mitzvah, the halacha of Trumas Adeshen from Trumas Midyan, which is 1 of 500. There the Gemara doesn't conclude to say that it doesn't apply for generations. Well, the Rabbi Yehuda says that follows very well with my approach. The Gemara only negates the 1 of 50, but the Gemara doesn't negate the 1 of 500. That's exactly what the Gemara wanted to treat and derive from Trumas Midyan in Masechta Yuma Daf Chav Daled Amud Aleph. The fact is, Tosfos argues with Rashi there in Masechta Yuma and says, no, let's rather not learn from Trumas Midyan, because Trumas Midyan wasn't for generations, number one. Number two, Tosfos says that we derive 1 of 50, not 1 of 500. So all of this is all connected. So let's not go there. I'm going to another reconciliation of the Rogatchover Gaon. Again, now let's just reset the button. We're resetting. And we're going back to another sequence of what the Rogatchover Gaon says. On the one hand, the Rogatchover Gaon used the Gemara in Masechta Menachos, where the Gemara says that the Trumas Midyan, right, which is the tribute tithe, which they brought in Midyan, whatever it was, either 1 of 500 for the soldiers, or the 1 of 50 for the ones who stayed behind, which were either given to the Kohanim or to the Leviim. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, because the Gemara says that it doesn't apply for generations. That's why that's a proof to the Rambam. But the Rambam says it was Yitzchak Hifrish Maaser and not Avram, because Avram was Mafrish a Maaser, which wasn't for generations. He was Mafrish Trumas Meches. He was Mafrish. He set aside a tribute tithe. That was to the Kohen, okay? And that's why the Rambam doesn't say that Avram Hifrish Maaser was only Yitzchak Hifrish Maaser. Nevertheless, the Rogatchover Gaon has glosses on the Zohar Harakia. And that is, when he sees the Zohar Harakia refuting the Rab Shlomo ibn Gabirol, who counts the mitzvah of Trumas Meches as one of the 613 mitzvahs, like the Baal Halachas Gdolos, and he holds it is for generations. And the Zohar Harakia refutes Rab Shlomo ibn Gabirol, okay, like the Rambam refutes the Bahag. And one of the refutes of the Zohar Harakia on the Azhoros of Rab Shlomo ibn Gabirol is, like we mentioned till now, is that the Gemara says that it is not for generations, it is not Ledoros, the Gemara in Menachos. Here comes the Rogatchover. So we mentioned the Rabbi Yehuda's reconciliation, right? The difference between 1 of 50 and 1 of 500. Listen to a novel reconciliation of the Rogatchover Gaon. And here we find an interesting thing with the Rogatchover Gaon. On the one hand, the Rogatchover Gaon says that we can use this Gemara to substantiate the Rambam, that it doesn't apply for generations. On the other hand, he argues that we can't ask a question on the opposing opinion. In other words, to substantiate and support the Rambam, that it's not for generations. You have a straightforward Gemara. It says it's not for generations. On the other hand, to refute the ones who hold that this mitzvah is for generations, we can't question them from this Gemara, because we can reconcile what the Gemara says. In other words, they may reconcile it as follows. Listen to his reconciliation. The Rogatchover Gaon says, Midyan is a total different ball game. And that is as follows. And he says, therefore, the Baal Halachas Gdolos, who holds that the Trumas Meches, the tribute tithe, does apply for all generations. And it's one of the 613 mitzvahs that applies to your standard regular war of a milchama. It can be a milchemes chayva or milchemes rishus. Now, there were many wars waged just to expand the territory. They wanted to conquer, to make conquest, to expand the territory. So a king would like to wage his war to expand his territory. And therefore he makes conquests and he wages war. And on that, those types of wars, Bahag, the Baal Halachas Gedolei says we derive from Midian that there's a Trumas Meches, that after they wage war to expand their territory, that's called Mechemes Oreshus. That's an optional war. So then there's a special halacha of giving a tribute tithe to the Kohanim. Okay, and that applies for generations. Now the Gemara says that Midian, where they gave the tribute tithe, does not apply for generations. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, don't ask a kasha. You can't refute the Bahag from this Gemara like the Zohar Harakia refutes it. He says, I will protect Rab Shloime ibn Gabirol. And he does that frequently in his glosses because he is fascinated by the beautiful poetry of Rab Shloime ibn Gabirol, and he says his poetry is fascinating, and therefore why you keep on refuting him? He doesn't like him. So even though in his whole approach and the counting of the mitzvahs, he seems to, the Zohar Harakia, the Azhoris of Rav Shlomo ibn Gabriel doesn't seem to eye with the Rambam. Nevertheless, the Rogatchover Gaon appreciates Rav Shlomo ibn Gabriel in his poetry, and therefore he says, even though he says that the Trumas Meches is for generations, you can't ask a kasha on him from the Gemara, even though the Rogatchover himself uses this Gemara to prove the Rambam right. But a kasha from this Gemara, you can't ask on the Bahag. Why? He says, you know why? Midian is a different kettle of fish. Midian wasn't your standard war. Take out your Chumash in Parshas Matos. In Parshas Matos, it says very clear as follows. Read in the Parsha. The Torah says that this war, this is not it's not a type of war. He says as follows. Moshe Rabbeinu is commanded by Hashem as follows. Let's read. The words of the Chumash reads. Let me just take out a Parshas Matos. In Parshas Matos, Kapitel Lamed Aleph Pasuk Gimel, it says, "Vayidaber Moshe Elohim Leimer, Hechol Tzami Itchem Anoshim Latzova, V'yu al Midian Loses Nikmas Hashem b'Midian," to inflict Hashem's vengeance against Midian. It's Nikama, it's vengeance. And the Ramban, there's a lengthy Ramban in Parshas Matos, and he makes it very clear. This is brought to our attention by the Rabbi in Likutei Sichos, Volume 2, in the additions in the Isofis to Parshas Matos. The Ramban tells us that the Midian was different than Sichon Va'oig. That's where we find something novel by Midian, which is not found by Sichon Va'oig. When they waged war with Sichon Va'oig, which took place prior to Midian, there the Torah doesn't talk about kashering, right? To cleanse the kalim, to kasher, to make the kalim, the utensils, which were the spoils, to make them kosher, to kosher the vessels. Why, says the Ramban? You know why? Because the rule is when the Jewish people wage war against their enemy, they're allowed to even eat non-kosher food. The din is, the Gemara says, afilu katle de chaziri ishtirolahu. Even non-kosher food, in order for the Jewish people to succeed in their war, and they should have what to eat. So even if there's only non-kosher food, they may eat that food. Therefore, when there's the plunder, when the spoils of the non-kosher vessels, if they can eat non-kosher food, they can even take part of the non-kosher vessels. They don't have to kosher the vessels. But Midian is a different type of, a total different kettle of fish, says the Ramban. Midian wasn't your regular war. Midian was for vengeance, was to take, that was vengeance of Hashem, Nikoma, to take Nikoma. That was vengeance. Oh, it's a total different ballgame, says the Ramban. For that, Hashem didn't permit them the non-kosher foods. And because Hashem didn't permit them to eat the non-kosher food, he also didn't permit them to take their spoiled, which are non-kosher vessels. And that's why we need to kosher the vessels. That's why it's found only by Midian. So we see very clear from this Ramban, but also from the Chumash, that the Geder, this is what the Rogatchover says, the Geder of Midian was not Milchama. The criteria of Midian was Nikama. And with this, he explains a lot of interesting things, which we find by Midian in Halacha, which is not like the regular war. The din is, the Rambam Paskins for us in Hilchas Malachim, that when the Jewish nation is waging war, you have to leave, you're not allowed to close them up. another surround them, encircle them from all four sides. You have to leave at least one area, one side open for the enemy to run away. But if you encircle them, says the Ramban, if you will encircle them from all sides, firstly, that's not merciful. You're not having any rachmanis even on the enemy. You have to have rachmanis on the enemy, number one. Number two, if they're going to feel encircled, they're going to become empowered because they have nowhere to run. So they're going to end up they're going to bring out deeper, stronger strength against the Jewish people. And therefore, we have to leave at least one side empty, open, for them to be able to run away. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, there's a machloikes in the Sifri. If in Midian, we have to have them, when it says Vayitzbu al Midian, they massed against Midian. So what does it mean they massed against Midian? So there are two opinions in the Sifri. One opinion says that they encircled them, but they left a fourth side open. And another opinion says, Vayitzbu al Midian, no, they encircled them from all four sides. They didn't leave a fourth side open for them to run away. Says the Rogatchover, you know why Midian didn't have a fourth side and they were encircled from Vayiten? You know why? Because it was vengeance. So therefore, there's no way we have mercy on them. We have to wipe them out and erase them from the face of the earth. That's why they have to be encircled from Vayiten. That's the meaning of this opinion in the Sifri. Another difference, says the Rogatchover Gaon, it says in the Pasuk, L'choil, the Levim, he says to count the soldiers, okay? And it says in the Torah, L'choil matos Yisrael, it says in Parshas Matos, Elef lamata, you take 1,000 from each tribe, and then it says L'choil matos Yisrael, for all the tribes of Israel. So those words seem to be superfluous. L'choil matos Yisrael. Why are they written? So there's a machlekes in Sifri. There are two versions in the text of the Sifri. One text reads, Lahoitzi Shevet Levi, meaning that Shevet Levi didn't take part in the war against Midian. And that would then identify it like with all wars, because with all wars, which the Jewish nation wages, the Rambam says that the Levites don't take part in the wars. The Rambam says so in Hilchos Shmita v'Yovel at the end of Sefer Zroim in Hilchos Shmita v'Yovel. So this text which says Lahoitzi Shevet Levi, meaning that Shevet Levi is not one of the thousand soldiers. They should not take part of the war of Midian to fight a wage against Midian. But another opinion says, another text which reads, L'Rabbi Shevet Levi. That's Rashi's text. Dafka Shevet Levi was part and parcel in waging and fighting and vengeance against Midian. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, oh boy, here we see that Midian is different than all the wars the Jewish nation wages against their enemy. Why all the wars, the Levites don't take part of the wars? Here they're taking part because this is a total different criteria. It's Nikoma. When the Nikoma, vengeance for Hashem, so then all people have to take part, even the Levites. So that's another thing the Rogatchover Gaon says in Parshas Matos. Another interesting thing the Rogatchover tells us in Parshas Matos. He says in Parshas Kiseitze we read that when there is a war, which is a standard war, an optional war, the Yefas Toyar, if there's a woman, which one of the soldiers would find would like to war one of the women in the, which he captured, one of the captives, one of the women, which is he finds favor in his eyes, he may take her and cohabit with her. That's the din of the Yefas Toyar in Parshas Kiseitze, La Melchama Alevecha. So that's the Parsha Kiseitze, where you find the din of the Yefas Toyar. Okay? Listen to this interesting thing. So the Rogatchover Gaon brings to our attention an interesting thing. The Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos, and this is what's found in the Chumash which we mentioned, that the commanders and the officers bring a special atonement for themselves with all the jewelry which they're giving, consecrating to the Mishkan. Says the Gemara, and Rashi brings this is, and the Chumash says it's an atonement for them. So the Gemara says, what atonement did they need? What do they need an atonement? Says the Gemara, because they were thinking about the Midianite women when they were doing the vengeance, when they were wiping them out, they were thinking about them. Asks Tosfos, hero thinking about Midianite women is a problem? You're even allowed to cohabit with them. You may even take one of them. A Yefas Toyer is mutter. So what could be wrong just about thinking about them? So you need an atonement? That's Tosfos Kasha in Masechta Shabbos Daf Samach Daled Amud Aleph. Take a look at the Tosfos. Tosfos reconciles and says, the woman you cohabit with, you can think about. You can't think about another woman. An extra one you can't. You only allowed one. So that's why they needed an atonement. Take a look at the Tosfos. The Rogatchover Gaon says a gewaldige thing. The Rogatchover Gaon says the din of Yefas Toyer, where there's a permit for the soldier to cohabit with one of the women in the enemy, the women, that's only in the normal regular war. But when it's the Nikoma, when it's vengeance for Hashem, no Yefas Toyer. That's not allowed. It's prohibited, says the Rogatchover Gaon. The Mela, with this we reconcile the question of Tosfos. That's why they needed an atonement. The Yefas Toyer attack is not allowed. Not like Tosfos says that the Yefas Toyer is allowed. Criteria of Midian is a total different ballgame. It's Nekama. The Mela says the Rogatchover, these are many different nafkaminis lahalacha. If criteria of Midian is Nekama, if it's vengeance, or it's identified to all the standard wars. With this, the Rogatchover says that even if we'll accept the Gemara in Masechta Menachos, Daf Ayin Zayin, that the Gemara says that it's that the tribute tithe is not noheg l'doros, right? And the one of the 500 is not noheg l'doros, or the one of 50 is not noheg l'doros. Says the Rogatchover, what will the Bahag who says that it is noheg l'doros? He says Trumas Mechas is a mitzvah l'doros. What will he do with this Gemara? Says the Rogatchover Gaon. The Gemara means as follows: Midian per se is not noheg l'doros. The one of 500 and the one of 50, which is when it is begeder nekama, when it's a criteria of vengeance, that doesn't apply for generations. That was an exceptional thing only by Midian. But for every other standard war, which is just to expand the territory, etc., that still remains of one of 500 to one of 50, or one of 500, which is meant to go to the Kohen. With this, the Rogatchover reconciles the question of the Zohar Arakia from the Gemara in Masechta Menachos on the Bahag. Even though, for the Rambam, he says the Rambam will definitely learn that this Gemara seems to negate the mitzvah of Trumas Mechas in total, as mentioned originally. The Rogatchover Gaon continues on, and he says, so what are we saying? That he's giving the Maaser. What is he giving Maaser from? He's giving Maaser from, okay, you know what? We'll just go on just a short while. Another fine point. And that is, it's going back to the Parshas Lech Lecha, where in Parshas Lech Lecha it says, Vayiten Maaser Mekol. So interestingly, as follows: what is the booty, right? What was plundered? So we have the spoils from listen to how much the spoils from the 4 kings, and the spoils from the 5 kings. Because realize the 4 kings wage war against the 5. And everything which the 5 kings owned, the 4 kings rip them off and take all the spoils from the 5, right? So they plunder whatever was owned by the 5. That's what the Chumash says. And the 4 kings take it. Now Avraham Avinu with Eliezer is coming to fight against the 4 kings, and they end up receiving in return everything which the 4 kings take from the 5. Exactly. And therefore, when we're reading the Chumash, it says in the Chumash, Vayiten Maaser Mekol, he gives the Kohen, the Shem ben Noach, he gives him the Maaser, he gives him the tithe, and then the Torah goes on to tell us that when it comes to the Melech Zdoim and Melech Zdoim, he says by the Melech Zdoim, it's a different ballgame. By Melech Zdoim, he says, you know what? I'm giving everything, I'm returning everything to the Melech Zdoim. You get it? Melech Zdoim was one of the 5 kings, right? Zdoim v'Amora. So all of Melech Zdoim, he takes nothing of Melech Zdoim. Like it says clearly in the Chumash, I'm not going to take anything from Melech Zdoim. He doesn't want to derive any benefit from Melech Zdoim. Okay? The reason in the Chumash it says because he doesn't want that Zdoim should claim that he made Avram wealthy. That's what it says in the Chumash. From the Gemara in Masechta Chulin, it comes out from the Rashi that it was regarded as theft. In other words, legally, he was meant to return it to Sdom, and we'll soon see why. And that is discussed why that was regarded as if to say that if Avram would have kept it, it would have been thievery, so to speak, and therefore he had to return it legally. We'll soon see. But let's go on. It says, Vayiten Maaser Mekol. So the Panim Yofei says, what is the Mekol? Plainly, it seems that he gives the Maaser from what? From the spoils. So why does it say Mekol? It could have just said Vayiten Maaser. After he waged war and he wins the war and he plunders the spoil and booty, so he gives him the Maaser from the booty. Why does it say Mekol? So the Panim Yofei claims that, you know what the Mekol is? The Mekol means even from the section which he's going to end up giving back to Sdom, like it says in the sequence of the Parsha, nevertheless, because originally he conquered it and he owned it. So once he conquered it and he owned it, therefore he's giving Maaser, he's giving the Truma to the Kohen from everything which he owned. And then he gives everything back to Sdom, saying that I don't want Sdom to claim that he made me wealthy. In other words, he says legally, if Avraham Avinu, by waging war, and he basically says, based on the Gemara in Masechta Gittin, that kibush milchama, when one makes conquest of another country or of another people, so the etzem waging war and being successful in the war, and so conquest of war is acquisition, makes acquisition. So therefore he acquired everything which was belonging to the 5 kings. He acquired everything which belonged to the 4 kings. And therefore now he's returning it on his own accord. He didn't have to return it to Sdom, says the Panim Yofei. And that's why before he returns it, because everything belonged to him, he has to give Maaser to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's why it says, Maaser Mekol, even from the section which he eventually gives back to Sdom. That's the take of the Panim Yofei. Panim Yofei concludes that he'd rather not learn that way, because he says, if that's the case, if Avram would have acquired everything, he really had no right to give it back to Sdom, because then there's a prohibition, a transgression of Lo Seichanim. Lo Seichanim means you're not allowed to give just a gift away to another, to the idol worshiper, and therefore he had no right to give it to Sdom. He's just giving him a gift in return. On what basis? So if he originally owned it, he couldn't give it to him as a gift. So he had to keep it. And if we see he gives it back to him, it doesn't mean to say he gives it back to him. It means he never acquired it. But it doesn't explain why he doesn't acquire it. Why didn't he acquire that section? Listen to the Rogatchover Gaon. Now, in general, from the Ramban, it also seems that he gives the tithe also from the section which belonged to Sdom. In other words, tithes were given to everything Avram conquered. Nevertheless, he gives back that section to Sdom. And there are many discussions in the Meforshei Torah, in the Parshiyah, in the Seder Parshiyahs from the Aderes, in the Maril Diskin, the Meshech Chochmah, exactly on what basis, and in the Panim Yofei and in the Sam Sefer, on what basis was it that Avram, what was the legal acquisition which Avram Avinu made, which allowed, and also the Marsha Masechta Chulin, what were the legal acquisitions which gave him the right to keep all of the booty which was plundered. Okay, now the Rogatchover Gaon says a fascinating thing. Listen to what the Rogatchover Gaon says. The Rogatchover Gaon says everything which belonged to the kings who are killed, so all of that property Avram acquired. But everything which belonged to the kings which remained alive, their property he did not acquire. And therefore, says the Rogatchover Gaon, what happened with Sdom, right? What does it say? Melech Sdom, right? He ends up saving. What does it say? It says clearly, Vayikchu. It says clearly, Vayikchu. In the Chumash, it says, Vayikchu es kol rechush Sdom, Vayikchu es Lot. So the 4 kings conquer all the property of Sdom and Amorah and all of Lot and his property. And then Avram Avinu wages war against them. And what does he do? He ends up returning all what belonged well, we belonged all the rechush, what belonged to light, etc. And Melech Sdoim comes out across to him, and he greets Avram Avinu, correct? Okay, says the Rogatchover going as follows. He says that what was plundered from the four kings, he was able to keep. How did Avram Avinu wage war, and how was he successful in winning the war? Now, Rashi in Chumash says that he only had 318 soldiers with him, and Rashi actually brings, that's what the Chumash says, Rashi brings that he didn't even have 318 soldiers. He had Eliezer with him. That means it was him and Eliezer. So what's going on there? Guess what? So Shem, according to the Gemara in Masechta Sanhedrin, Daf Kuf Ches, page 108, and Daf Kuf Tes, page 109. And this is also found, so the Gemara says that Shem, the son of Noach, asks Eliezer, how did you wage war and win the war? You're only individuals. How were you able to win over on those four kings? Guess what? He says, you know what? Because we had the dust, we just picked up some dust, and Avram Avinu, we threw it at the enemy, and you know what became of the dust? From the dust became swords, and the swords killed the enemy. And then we picked up straw, and from the straw became arrows. We threw straw at the enemy, and it became arrows. And the Gemara says it's exactly what happened. Says the Gemara, Kodesh Baruch Hu, before Avram had to wage war against the four kings, Kodesh Baruch Hu sat on the right side of Avram Avinu, and the Meforshim say he brings the angels, Malach Michael, and together with the angels, he wages war against the four kings, and therefore the dust become swords, and the straw become arrows, and with that he wipes out the enemy. Wow, gewaldig. Now listen, what happens? So according to that, he was able to keep, says the Rogatchover, as follows. So the whole miracle, the whole war was based on what? On miracles, based on miracles. The din is as follows. Now, by the way, this miracle earth, right, this miracle dust, is also recorded in sequence in the Gemara and Sanhedrin, and also in Masechtas Tainis Daf Chafalev with Nachem Ish Gamzu. And Nachem Ish Gamzu also had to bring a gift to the emperor, and they stayed overnight in a motel, and they ripped off all the jewels which were supposed to be given as a gift. And the people in the motel, right, part of the gift from the guest house, ended up taking out the jewels and fill it up with dust. And then he brings it and he says, Gamzu l'toiva, it's all for the good. And he brings it to the emperor, and they says, what are you giving us, dust? And they wanted to what? They wanted to like behead him. And then Eliyahu Hanavi reveals himself, and he says, maybe this is the dust which Avram Avinu waged war against the four kings. Rashi explains, and therefore that's so you should know. And it says, the Gemara says that the emperor, the Roman emperor, had some enemies he wasn't able to conquer, and he used the dust, and it worked for him. Says the Gemara with that. That's the Gamzu l'toiva. It worked for Nachem Ish Gamzu, and the Gemara says for that he got a special gift from jewels and special jewels and precious gems, which the Roman emperor gave back to Nachem Ish Gamzu. Nachem Ish Gamzu travels back and stays overnight in that hotel. And the fellows say, how do you merit to get all those special things? He says, because we gave him such dust, which Avram Avinu says, where'd you get the dust? The dust which we got from your house. So the guy dismantles his house and brings all the dust from underneath his house. And he goes to the Roman emperor. And it doesn't work this time. It didn't work. You get it? Because it was Eliyahu Hanavi and HaKadosh Baruch Hu which injected that dust, but it wasn't just the plain dust. So therefore, all the people from the motel were beheaded by the Roman emperor. But Nachem Ish Gamzu was saved thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's nest with Eliyahu Hanavi. That's the sequence of the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Gemara in the Masechta Tainis Daf Chafalev. So the Rogatchover Gaon says to us as follows. Rogatchover says, Rashi tells us, in Masechta Tainis Daf Chav Dalet, page 24, Rashi says, Osur lehonois mimaisa nisim. It's prohibited to derive benefit from something you acquire via a miracle. Rashi says a prohibition, Osur. It's not just a good trait, not for whatever, but it's prohibited. It's a prohibition, says Rashi in Masechta Tainis Daf Chav Dalet. The man says the Rogatchover going as follows. When it came to the four kings, so the miracle wiped them out, knocked out the four kings and killed them. Now, the din is, so how did they acquire the booty, right? What was plundered? So the booty, right? The spoils did he acquire via a miracle? No. The kings were killed via a miracle. Because the kings were killed via a miracle, so then all the property becomes ownerless. Because there's no more owner, the owner's dead. So the owner, which was killed via a miracle, is not here. So his property becomes ownerless. So the ownerless property Avraham Avinu can acquire, because it's now an indirect benefit from the miracle. It's not a direct benefit from the miracle. The miracle just killed the owner. Now, once there's no owner, so the property is ownerless. So therefore, all those spoils Avraham Avinu can acquire. Says the Rogatchover Gaon, all of those spoils he gave Maaser from, because he acquired them. He was allowed to acquire it because that is an indirect benefit from the mess. So that allows him to acquire it. And the thing is, when you acquire something as spoils in a war, you have to give Maaser. So that from there it says, Vayiten Maaser Mekol. But when it came to this dime, the kings remained alive. Light remained alive. Sdaim, the Melech's dime remains alive. You get it? What did the miracle attain? The miracle attained, what did it gain for him? The miracle made that the property which was stolen from the 4 kings, from the 5 kings, doesn't become ownerless. It was theft, it was thievery. The 4 kings ripped off the 5 kings their property, right? Now that therefore we kill the 4 kings, what the 4 kings owned, Avraham Avinu acquires, because their property is ownerless, but the property of the 5 kings, which was stolen by the 4 kings, goes back to their original owner. But to say that Avraham Avinu acquired it because he waged war, and when you wage war, that makes acquisition, like the Gemara says in Gittin, says the Rogatchover Gaon, that's Maaser Nisim. He acquired it via a miracle, and it's prohibited to derive benefit from a miracle. So he couldn't have acquired halachically, legally, the property of Zdaim. So therefore, he did not give tithes from the property of Zdaim, because tithes you have to give from your own property when you acquire. But the property of Zdaim he wasn't allowed to acquire, because that he acquired, that he attained, that he gained via the miracle, because that's what released the property of Zdaim. You get it? I hope you understand that was a direct benefit. Because that was a direct benefit, he wasn't allowed to acquire it. Because he wasn't allowed to acquire it, therefore he didn't give tithes from it. Therefore, he gives everything back to Zdaim. He gives everything back to Zdaim, and he didn't separate tithes from what he returns to Zdaim. The Rogatchover goes on to continue and explain different details of the Torah, but because we're definitely over time. So with this Rogatchover, with the way he analyzes the difference between the spoils of the other kings and the spoils of Zdaim, it can reconcile many other questions raised and issues raised by the Panim Yafes and other Mefarshim, but time doesn't allow to elaborate. So thanks a lot for, with this we end. We ended long ago, but thanks to Menchi, our technician, they allowed us to continue recording the shir. And thanks very much for all those who continued hanging in. And again, Yashikaya, thank you, Rabbi Yankel Rapp, for dedicating the shir for the memory of your father. It should be Laliyas Nishmasai. And Yashikaya, everybody out there, keep safe. I just want to conclude with mentioning that Zayin Cheshvan is the yard site from Rab Meir Shapiro from Lublin, right, from the Chachme Lublin, who was instituted at Daf Yomi, etc. Also, let me just bring to your attention, there was a special relationship of the Rogatchover with Rab Meir Shapiro. Rab Meir Shapiro wanted the Rogatchover to employ the Rogatchover as a Rosh Yeshiva, because he wanted to try to attract the whole European jury and all the students to come to Lublin to study in his yeshiva. So he felt that if he would employ the Rogatchover Gaon, who was a Welt's Gaon, and everybody knew of the Rogatchover Gaon, if he'll make him the Rosh Yeshiva, he will be able to attract many more students. And there's a lot of correspondence between the Rogatchover and Rab Meir Shapiro in the response and correspondence. It's the Rogatchover, and he mamish bent backwards to give the Rogatchover all the request the Rogatchover needed to make himself comfortable. But at the end of the day, it seems like other individuals, the Rogatchover started to realize that there are issues over there involved. There was some politics which got caught up there, it seems. And there were others who queried if the Rogatchover will be successful because of his great genius. They were unsure if he was able to relate to the students. So others wanted to, I don't know if they wanted to torpedo it, but therefore it didn't come to fruition. And it never became. I just read in this week's Hamodia that actually Rabbi Shapiro wanted to make a Liyal Eretz Yisrael. He wasn't Zeicha. And he wanted to, in Tveria or in Sfas, he wanted to build 4 buildings, and one of the buildings should be set aside for a separate section. They're right, the different sections, Shisha, Sidra, Mishnah. He wanted each building should be set aside for a separate section of the Talmud. Shisha, Sidra, Mishnah. Each building should have a separate Rosh Yeshiva. And each Rosh Yeshiva should teach a different section of the Talmud, a different section of the Mishnayos. And over there in the Hamodia, Mefurish Hamodia, it says that the Rabbi Shapiro considered to have the Rogatchover come to Eretz Yisrael and be a Rosh Yeshiva in one of the buildings. And it never occurred, whatever, it never happened. Also, I would like to mention that, if I recall correctly, it's also, so it should be, Chusi Yogan Aleinu Rabbi Shapiro was a Gewaldige Yid, and the Rebbe, he was at the Rebbe's wedding. Everybody knows he was in Warsaw at the Rebbe's wedding, and he gave the Rebbe his Shailas Teshuvas Eira Meir, and it's in the Rebbe's library, and he inscribed it as a gift to the Rebbe, and they talked in learning during the Rebbe's wedding. The Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, the father-in-law of the Rebbe, requested of the Rebbe to this talk and learning with Rabbi Shapiro, and they talked in learning. And by one of the Fabrengens, the Rebbe mentioned this, that he talked in learning with Rabbi Shapiro, and he received a Dorin Droshe Shailas Teshuvas, and it's in the Rebbe's library today. And he mentioned and discussed the whole thing. Rabbi Shapiro, in one of his responses, he discusses a Rashi and Chumash. The Rebbe addressed it in one of his sichos throughout the years. I don't remember what year it was. You can check it out. Another thing I would like to mention, another great Rav, who was a Rav in Brooklyn, in the United States, Rab Simcha Elberg. Rab Simcha Elberg was a Talmid of Rab Menachem Zembe in Warsaw, and he was a gewaldige Gaon. He was a big agudist. He worked for the Aguda. He was also the right-hand man of Rab Moshe Feinstein, Olav Hasholem, and he was a very big activist for Yiddishkeit. He authored the Pardes, the Torah publication, but he was a very strong, staunch activist and a gewaldige, dedicated person to the Rebbe's in Yonim. Whatever the Rebbe had to implement, he was a key person. He used to come to the Rebbe's Fabrengens regularly, continuously, always by the Rebbe's Fabrengens, and always recorded and repeated the Rebbe's Fabrengens in his Torah publication, and also implemented many different shlichusim for the Rebbe. And I believe today Zayin Cheshvan is his yahrzeit. His Memele Yeh Zichrei Baruch. He had left child, passed away childless, like Rabbi Shapiro. So Yeh Zichrei Baruch, it should be with Zikoron. Al Kolpani, with this we end. Keep safe. L'chaim l'vracha. Thanks for having, thanks for coming. Good night. A gute Nacht.